listening to the Construction Big Breakfast, where we give you a hearty serving of insider tips and business strategies to help fuel your day so you can thrive in the construction industry. Now, here's your host, Tip Top Tim Fitch.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. I'm your host, Tip Top Tim Fitch, and welcome to the latest episode of the Construction Big Breakfast. Today we're going to be diving into some really interesting topics, a bit different for us. We're going to hear all about what a parliamentary agent does, and with special reference to a number of very big projects I'm sure everyone's familiar with, including Crossrail, High Speed 2 and the up and coming A66. Joining me today for this particular podcast is our very special guest, Robbie Owen.
Morning.
Welcome to the podcast, Robbie. Can you give the listeners a little introduction to yourself?
Yes, well, good morning everybody. I'm Robbie Owen. I'm a planning partner at Pinsent Masons, the international law firm, and I head up our UK infrastructure planning and government affairs business.
Robbie, it's great to have you on today. The first question before we get into the topics, and I'm sure you've prepared well for this, is what did you have for breakfast today?
Well, I had a couple of cups of tea as per, and then I had a slice of toast with Marmite and some sliced fresh tomatoes.
Not bad?
Not bad.
Not bad at all?
It was fine for Monday.
Yeah, very well.
Yeah.
Well, I got up, pumped iron, and when I got home I had a muffin, toasted muffin and 2 fried eggs.
Very good.
And some coffee.
Yeah.
So,
I'm afraid I didn't have time for eggs this morning. It's a bit of a quick one.
yeah, well, it's digressing a little bit. Frying eggs is really quick, and it doesn't add very much fat. A lot of people say, oh, that must be terrible for you, but all the fat comes off if you cook them properly.
But you know what though, if you fry eggs without fat, which you can do if you've got the right saucepan, they still taste completely different to poached eggs. Why is that? Anyway.
Don't know, we'll have to get someone from the food tech industry to explain that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Robbie, great to have you on. You mentioned in the intro that you're a parliamentary agent. Now, I think I know what that is, but I reckon most of our listeners won't. So can you just tell us what a parliamentary agent does?
It's quite a hard thing to summarise or to talk about succinctly, but essentially you are the agent, and we're all lawyers. There are 15 or so of us working as parliamentary agents in the UK. We're all lawyers, and you are acting as the agent for someone that needs representation in Parliament, by which I mean the Westminster Parliament nowadays. Obviously there's other parliaments as well in the UK, but so you are instructed by an outside person, so it could be a local authority, it could be a major landowner, to advise them and represent them in relation to parliamentary proceedings. Now, what sort of parliamentary proceedings? When in the 1840s and 50s there were loads of railway bills going through Parliament and bills for canals, before then parliamentary agents would act for the promoters of those measures, so people like Invennt, Kingdom, Grinnell, Great Western Railway Company, and also they would be instructed by landowners and those affected by the schemes. So you were the agent for the promoter of the bill or people that didn't want it either at all or through their landholding. And all of our major railways, ports, canals, they were all authorised individually by Acts of Parliament. So the parliamentary agent would act for those people I've described in relation to the bill, which became an act in due course. So, and we still have that today because our largest infrastructure projects still proceed by way of bills considered in Parliament. So since I've been practicing for the last 35 years, we've had bills for the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, which is now HS1. We have had 2 hybrid bills so far, they're called hybrid bills, for HS2 Phase 1 and Phase 2A. We had a hybrid bill for Crossrail, Crossrail 1 as it was called when Crossrail 2 was being contemplated. Crossrail 1, of course, due to open tomorrow.
Yeah, we're filming on the 23rd.
Yeah, 24th of May tomorrow. We had hybrid bills for Cardiff Bay Barrage, Second Severn Crossing, Dartford Thurrock Crossing, and the Queen Elizabeth Bridge. So all those bills involve parliamentary agents acting for the promoters, so in those cases the government, and acting for local authorities, landowners, communities affected by them. And we're about to restart that with HS2 Phase 2B, which is the bill for taking HS2 from Crewe to Manchester. So that's the next.
That's the next one on the block.
Yeah.
Well, let's just, by way of reference to Crossrail, which obviously is super topical. Obviously, you've had a lot of involvement in it. I had some years ago. What does the parliamentary agent's role look like on a massive mega project like that when you're trying to get something through the Parliament for the...
So if you are the agent for the government, so in most cases the Secretary of State for Transport, his department, her department appoints an agent, you are working alongside the government lawyers in relation to those provisions of the bill, which becomes an act, that affect private interests, so compulsory purchase, highways, water courses, etc. So you work with the government to put the whole package together, which takes 2-3 years before the bill even appears. So the HS2 Phase 2B bill that was published a couple of months ago now, they would have been working on that for 3 or 4 years. It's a big thing to get a bill ready for Parliament. All the plans, all the environmental assessment needs to be done, all the consultation and stakeholder engagement. So that's your role, and when the bill reaches Parliament, when it's published, as it was HS2 Phase 2B a couple of months ago, you're then representing the government in arguing why the bill should be passed. There will be amendments to the bill that have to be dealt with, and you'll be doing that arguing mainly in committee proceedings where those who don't want the bill to be passed in that form turn up with the likes of myself, and we. So if you're the parliamentary agent for an objector, they're called petitioners. They still use this sort of Victorian language. So if you're the parliamentary agent for the petitioner, you turn up and argue why the project shouldn't be permitted in precisely that phase, in that form. You can't, for a government measure like HS2 Phase 2B, you can't turn up and actually object to it in principle, because by the time it gets to the committee stage, it will have had a second reading by the House of Commons, and that signifies that Parliament approves the principle of the measure. So your scope is limited to arguing about detail, but very important detail. So with HS2 Phase 1, and I remember going back to 2005 to 2008 with Crossrail, there were many days worth of committee proceedings in both houses of Parliament, so the Commons and the Lords, where the government was arguing why certain concerns from petitioners were misfounded, and the petitioners were arguing no, they weren't. So we were involved. The big win that we had with Crossrail back in 2005-06 was we were representing a large landowner who was arguing that the Liverpool Street station for Crossrail should have a second exit near Liverpool Street station. This was heavily resisted by the government at the time and through their agents in committee, and the committee found for the petitioners, so they required the government to go away and amend the bill to provide for there to be a second entrance and exit for the Liverpool Street station in the heart of the city. And government yielded to that, brought forward amendments, and the bill was then changed. So occasionally you have big victories like that. More often you have much smaller but important victories for landowners and local authorities that make changes to the bill, that give assurances and undertakings about how the project will be built, all that sort of stuff.
So I know in the case of Crossrail, didn't that result in an enormous number of obligations during the construction phase?
And the same for HS2 Phase 1 and 2A. Government have a register of undertakings and assurances that applies to that applied to the construction of HS1 indeed, HS2 Phase 1 and Phase 2A and Crossrail. So all of those big projects, the government have adopted the same sort of template of having this register of undertakings and assurances which are given during the parliamentary passage, and they then get logged in this register to make sure that they are then delivered, and it's largely down to the contractors, because most of these commitments the government give sort of bite on the construction phase. It's down to the contractors to make sure they are then delivered, which is obviously a complex process to make sure they're all tracked and secured. So you're talking about many thousands.
I've got this number in my head because I was involved in this very peripherally. On Crossrail, I thought there was tens of thousands.
It could well be.
I've got a number of 40,000 in my mind. Whether I've misremembered that.
I mean, you can imagine. Well, I mean, with Crossrail, no one really objected to the principle of Crossrail. I mean, even if they wish to, as I said earlier, you can't really. But whereas obviously with HS2, it's a rather different matter. There are people who still fundamentally don't agree with the concept of HS2. But with Crossrail, it was universally accepted, but still there were several thousands, maybe more, as you say, Tim, I can't remember, I'm afraid, commitments given by government during the passage of the bill, which then had to be delivered. And some of those will affect operations as well, therefore they will have a continuing obligation to deliver. But it's important also to remember that these bills authorising these mega projects still only really authorise the concept and the principle. There's loads of detail that then has to be developed once the bill's enact and receive further approvals from mainly local authorities. So it's quite important for contractors to understand that sort of downstream consenting process, because it's obviously important, and you can't put the spade in the ground very often until you've got those further, more detailed consents.
So what would that sort of the next phase of the consenting process look like on Crossrail? Because obviously that runs through many local authorities, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's things like agreement on detailed design, agreement on landscaping, agreement on lorry routes, all these sort of things. There's a schedule in the in the Crossrail Act, and there equally is in the HS2 Phase 1 Act, that sets out what are these detailed approvals that are still required. They're a bit like planning conditions, really. So with a typical planning permission for any form of development, you get given permission subject to conditions. Well, again, the HS2 and Crossrail Acts were passed by Parliament subject to conditions, and particularly requiring these further approvals from local authorities on points of detail. They are quite constrained in terms of the extent to which they can sort of approve those further details with further conditions, or the extent to which they can reject them. So the Act sets that, the Act sort of gives them their parameters, a bit of a straitjacket, if you like, and that has actually given rise to some litigation, particularly, not surprisingly, on HS2. I think with Crossrail, it was all pretty trouble-free in terms of contention and litigation, whereas certainly not the case with HS2. It's still fairly early days with HS2, of course, in terms of construction.
Well, let's just pass on to High Speed 2, because I live not on the route, but a mile or two to one side of it, and my parents live on the other side of it, closer. And there is and this is in
Buckinghamshire, is it?
No, I'm South West Hertfordshire,
Yeah.
and my parents are in the London Borough of Hillingdon. But the route goes very close to where they live, and both there and where we live in Rickmansworth, there's still quite a lot of agitation around trying to stop it when the tunnels have started. There's huge earthworks going on. They've still got big billboards up saying stop High Speed 2, things like that. But just because Crossrail is so much less contentious, compare and contrast a bit with High Speed 2 in terms of the Parliamentary Act went through, and then with lots of debate on both sides, but it was backed, if I remember correctly, by all the major parties. But what's happened since the bill was passed with the ongoing litigation, outside of that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think the differences stem from the fact that Crossrail was universally accepted as being a good thing. This was, of course, quite some time before all of the levelling up debate and the calls for greater investment in the north of England and the Midlands. I mean, I wonder if Crossrail was being proposed now, what reception it would get. But so this was, let's not forget that Crossrail had its origins in a 1970s study. It was brought forward originally as a private bill in Parliament by London Underground and what was then British Rail. That was rejected by a committee of the House of Commons in 1994, from memory, I think it was, or yes, 1994, 1995, I think. Government then took it on themselves as a government measure. They got it back into Parliament in 2005, and it got through in 2008. So the Crossrail Act of 2008, which was still a long time ago. And there was no trouble I can recall then in terms of getting possession of land. There might have been the odd one, but nothing that hit the headlines. Whereas with HS2 Phase 1 at Euston, you know the story, and I think there was something published last week. Was it saying £200 million they're going to be spending on taking possession of sites and then securing them? Why is it different? I think just because it's I mean, in terms of length, of course, I haven't got precise stats in my head, but HS1, of course, must be 70, 80 miles from the coast to St Pancras. That was built with very little protest and general acceptance. I mean, I remember when what was then the Channel Tunnel Rolling Bill was going through Parliament between 94 and 1996. Yeah, there were big debates about impact on the countryside, whether there should be longer tunnels here and there, and that debate was had and I think resolved to most people's satisfaction. It's a good question. What is different then with HS2, particularly Phase 1? Is it just because the project is so contentious that even once the parliamentary stage is finished, it doesn't die down, or actually it seems to me to have got worse since the parliamentary stage finished, not got better? Or is it because society is slightly changing and we no longer accept, to the same extent we used to, judgments of Parliament and our institutions? I think it's a very good question. I'm afraid I don't have the answer. But I do think sort of civil mistrust in officialdom, if I can call it that, has increased, which is worrying because we obviously have the rule of law in this country and most of us believe in it. And once everyone's had their ability to have a say, and of course the thing with the parliamentary process I was talking about earlier is if you are especially directly affected by a proposal, if you're a landowner or a local authority, you can directly intervene in Parliament and have your say. That rule doesn't extend to people who aren't especially directly affected, so they're obviously continuing their protest now.
I was talking to a friend of mine in the last few days who's working with the landowners to get their compensation.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of cut and shuffle because they've lost a bit of a field there, and all sorts of provisions that having to be made. He said there's going to be work for years and years and years.
Yes, I mean there isn't, and I don't think, it doesn't appear to me, and I haven't got a direct interest in any compensation cases now, some colleagues of mine have, but it doesn't appear to me that HS2 Limited in particular have covered themselves in glory in terms of how they've dealt with the compensation process, because when the bill goes through Parliament, discussions then can't generally focus on compensation. There are a few cases where you can argue, if there are special circumstances, that the compensation code, which is the term given to the collection of laws that govern what compensation you get for compulsory purchase, you can argue in some cases that won't be fair when it's applied, and therefore the bill should have a particular additional provision written into it. But generally speaking, when the bill's in Parliament, you can't talk about compensation. It's the same for other procedures that don't involve Parliament for infrastructure schemes. So compensation is left for when it comes to implementation. And it's a hugely complex area of law. It's grown up over many, many years. Some of it dates from Victorian times. I was interested to see the government is now looking at reviewing this. Of course, it's a massive task, not necessarily seen as a vote winner, which is why it keeps on being delayed. I mean, I was involved in a campaign in the mid-1990s. Actually, it was called the Crossrail Compensation Campaign, to try and, off the back of Crossrail, get the laws of compensation for compulsory purchase reviewed. But it went to the Law Commission, they produced a report, government then sort of sidelined it, thinking, well, you know, we haven't got time for it now. So yes, I mean, it'll produce work for years and years and years, until, I would say, for 5 years after the last phase of HS2 opens. So the last phase, if they end up building the eastern leg of phase 2B, when will that be finished? Heaven knows. Add another 5 years and there will still be work for advisors, including lawyers, surveyors, valuers.
So parents, if you've got children
Yes.
heading to university, this could be a good, solid career.
Yeah.
Maybe for the next 25, well, a whole career's worth of effort, possibly. That's been really interesting on that, Robbie. Now, you're involved in a project which is at an earlier stage, I think it was the A66.
Yes.
For those that don't know, where's the A66 running to and from?
So the A66 is a beautiful stretch of highway. It starts at Scotch Corner, junction with the A1, going westwards all the way into Cumbria, up to the M6. It carries on eastwards from the M6, but this project is the M6 to the Scotch Corner stretch, which is 50 or 60 miles from memory. And over the years, most sections of it have been dualled, but about 1/3 approximately is not dualled, and government, there have been schemes for several years now to look at dualling the remaining sections. Difficulty is it goes through extremely beautiful parts of Durham, Cumbria, North Yorkshire, and it's difficult to work out an acceptable scheme to dual the remaining sections. Anyway, government's fastened on this as a key part of its levelling up programme for Northern England, and they are very anxious for construction to start, subject to all the consents being given in the first quarter of 2024. So it's a key levelling up project, and it's an important part of our strategic road network, because over 25% of the traffic on that stretch of the A66 are HGVs, going from the East Coast ports to Scotland and Northern Ireland. So a key strategic route, has a very high and unacceptably high level of accidents and fatalities, sadly. So myself and many colleagues at Pinsent Masons are currently advising National Highways on preparing the equivalent for this sort of scheme of the hybrid bill in Parliament I was talking about, which is an application for what's called a development consent order, which again is a complex form of planning permission that gives authority for works to be constructed, compulsory purchase of land, deals with interference with other highways, watercourses. So it's a big consent that has been used for a lot of big highway schemes in the last 10 years. So we're very close to being able to submit the application for the development consent order to the Secretary of State for Transport, and that will be shortly now. That will then go off to a process run by the Planning Inspectorate, where they will hold a public examination of the application, looking at all of the assessments and appraisals, hearing concerns from local authorities, from landowners, from community groups, and we'll be there for National Highways, explaining how the scheme has got to where it's got to, because obviously a hugely complex number of options appraisals have been carried out over many years by technical consultants to National Highways. And where I think this project also, and we've seen this gradually over the years now. I mean, I think the Bank Station upgrade is a case in point where Dragados were appointed by Transport for London and London Underground several years before the consent in that case was given. So they were able to really input in terms of constructability advice during the planning stage, which until then hadn't really been done very often. Might seem surprising to you, but these schemes were mainly sort of authorised without sort of hands-on construction input, if I can put it that way. That began to change with things like Bank Station, but for the A66, National Highways under its framework has 3 contractors already working on it, providing input into the planning stage. So with the intention being that, that there's a 99.9% chance that the scheme as authorised will then be one that can be built exactly as envisaged with no unanticipated impacts or delays. So,
Robbie, you just got my juices flowing because I know all about Bank, which obviously was the first time a very innovative procurement process.
And a really tricky scheme.
Very, very difficult, and that's almost about time, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. No, I think the blockade is now finished slightly early, which is good news.
And I saw this very morning that the oversight development opportunity is being advertised, which I had a lot to do with at the time. Anyway, on that note, let's wrap up this conversation. It's been tremendously insightful, certainly for me, and I should know about this stuff, but I've learnt an awful lot today. So thank you for joining me today, Robbie.
You're very welcome.
I'm guessing the listeners can get in touch with you. We can put your email if you wish,
very happy to.
Your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. If anyone wants to learn more about becoming a parliamentary agent, or they've got a big scheme that they want promoting. Terrific, wonderful. And to all of our listeners today, thank you for tuning in. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Construction Big Breakfast. We have a new episode published every week, so click the subscribe button, which will be down there somewhere. Turn on your notifications so you don't miss a single episode. While you're at it, we'd appreciate a 5-star review, and if you've enjoyed this episode today, please like it and share it, as that helps us reach more listeners. If you'd like to be a guest on the podcast or looking to collaborate in other ways, visit us at our website, invennt.com. The link is in the description, and fill out the contact form, and one of my team will be in touch very shortly. So, see you next time. Bye.
Thanks for joining us this week on the Construction Big Breakfast. Make sure to visit our website, www.inventt.com, where you can subscribe to the Construction Big Breakfast on all platforms, so you'll never miss a show. While you're at it, if you found value in the show, we'd appreciate a positive rating. Or if you'd simply share it with a friend, that would help us out too. Be sure to tune in for our next episode.